Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, How to Spot C2 Traffic on Your Network, sponsored by Corelight. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Vincent Stoffer, Senior Director of Product Management at Corelight, and Matt Bromley, SANS Certified Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to John Gamble of Corelight, who will be moderating today's webcast.
Thanks, Carol. I'm John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing here at Corelight. As Carol mentioned, I will be emceeing today's broadcast and doing a little bit of presenting myself, but mostly I'm excited to have you hear from today's featured panelists, Matt and Vince. Guys, I'm gonna let you guys introduce yourself. Matt, maybe you could go first.
Hey everyone, Matt Bromley here. You've probably recognized my voice from some webcasts we've done in the past. I'm happy to be joining Corelight again. John, Vince, thanks for having me here. I am a SANS instructor as well as an active SANS analyst and incident responder, one who wears multiple hats inside of the security industry. And I'm just once again excited because this is one of my favorite pieces of software in the world. This is one of my favorite teams and one of my favorite concepts. So I'm gonna quiet down my excitement, Vince, and let you introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks, Matt, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Vince Stoffer. I'm on the product team here at Corelight. Excited to talk to you about a new collection of content around command and control that we have today, as well as a bunch of the ways that Zeek and Corelight can make your life easier when looking for C2 traffic on your network. As I mentioned, I'm on the product team, formerly a network and security engineer, so a user of all of the tools that we were going to talk about today. And thanks, John. Back to you.
Awesome, thanks guys. Quickly, just an agenda. We're gonna level set knowledge on C2 around the Mitre attack framework. Then we'll do a quick introduction to Zeek and cover some of its core capabilities, which will be important because then we'll go into some hunting demonstrations to show you how you, using Zeek evidence, could find evidence of C2s in your own environment. Then we'll introduce Corelight and ground our capabilities. And then we'll shift to a couple different demonstrations of some of our C2 detection capabilities that Vince just alluded to that were recently released in our most recent software update. And we'll close with Q&A. If you have questions, please ask them at any point during this broadcast using the questions part of your panel. I'll see them and we're gonna hold Q&A until the end. So with that, let's get started. And this is the section that I'll actually get to present. So Mitre attack framework, I'm gonna assume most people on the call are familiar with and or using this framework to do their job in a security operations team or as a team of one. It's a great way to understand adversarial movement and techniques in your environment. And it's a great kind of rubric to understand where you have coverage and where you have gaps in your environment. And the way that this matrix is organized is from left to right. It starts with initial access and it goes all the way to impact, where data has been exfiltrated or systems have been compromised and damaged. And it's basically a chronological, roughly chronological ordering of the ways that attackers are breaking into your system, spreading laterally, understanding what's in your environment, and ultimately doing the damage that they set out to do, whether that's exfiltrating data or shutting off access to systems internally and holding them ransom. Now, the interesting thing to note about the Mitre attack framework here is that the first half tends to be an endpoint favorable activity with respect to discovering these techniques or detecting them. And the right half tends to be more favorable for the network. And the reason is because if you think about it, the initial entry points and footholds that adversaries gain in an organization tend to be on endpoints, right? It's a phishing email that goes to your CFO that downloads a malicious file on his or her computer. That could be the initial foothold, right, in an environment. And of course, endpoint software, EDR software, for example, running on that particular computer is a great way to observe and detect that activity. The latter part of this attack matrix describes activities that are more broad-based in nature. These are communications and patterns of movement across time, which, sure, you might have endpoint coverage on some of those movements, but with BYOD, with internal databases, with cloud, there's a very good chance that you're not catching all of these communications. And more importantly, you're not seeing the forest for the trees, because the network is an excellent place to make sense of all of those communications and pattern match and understand what looks like anomalies in your environment. And that's absolutely true for command and control, which is the topic of today's webcast. We're going to go deep here. There's 16 Mitre attack specified command and control techniques, and there's a number of sub techniques within those. So we're talking about dozens and dozens of different ways that adversaries can leverage command and control techniques in your environment to kind of spread their reach and do more damage. So 38 in total, right? I mentioned there's sub techniques under the 16. As an example, non-standard port, right? An adversary might say, you know what, I'm gonna go on port 443 because I believe that the security team there is going to be bypassing inspection of that traffic because they're going to believe that it's encrypted SSL traffic. Now, I'm not going to use an encrypted protocol, but I'm going to run my communications for C2 over port 443 under the guise of it not being inspected, and they might be right. Another great example is they might say, you know what, I believe that I can hide my C2 activity by communicating with legitimate public web services, right? Things that don't look abnormal, that are permitted in most organizations, but nonetheless are a great place to hide amidst the noise and do crafty things like, oh, I don't know, use Twitter, right? We've got examples of people that are actually using Twitter as a mechanism in their C2 infrastructure. And in this particular example, this screenshot you see here, the adversaries went even a step further, and they weren't just plain text tweeting instructions that they were pulling in and accessing from internal systems. They were actually embedding the instructions in an image file itself. So it was a layer upon layer of obfuscation, but a great example here of two of the many different kinds of C2 techniques that we're trying to figure out, are these happening in my environment and what can I do about them? Now, you can of course detect this activity, but you can also discover it, right? Proactively look for it in your environment, threat hunting. We're going to talk about both methods today, both detection and discovery. But first, let's talk about discovery. To discover something, you need data to validate your hypothesis. You might say, I wonder if anybody's abusing Twitter in my environment in that way that I just described in the previous slide. Well, how are you going to go looking for that information? So you need data, right? But what data? Well, you could go with what I would call traditional network data sources, which are data sources that are coming off of logs generated by appliances in your physical networked environment that, let's be honest, most of them weren't designed for security use cases. They were typically designed around network performance and troubleshooting, i.e. IT use cases, right? These are logs that these appliances like your SMTP server or your router kicks off that are really intended for someone who's trying to troubleshoot the performance of the device itself or debug it. Now, security teams grab this data because it's available. It doesn't mean that it's great data optimized for the problems that we're trying to solve for here. And what happens really is, even if you're lucky enough to get all of these logging systems turned on, and even if you're lucky enough to get them all aggregated and centralized in a single source, as a security analyst, you're still faced with a really challenging puzzle game where you've got a bunch of pieces who may not fit together correctly or even at all. Timestamps may be misconfigured, data fields may be missing that you need, and it can be really, really frustrating because there's gaping visibility gaps left in between all of these kind of piecemeal IT logs that people tend to collect. So it's not a great place to look for network data if you're trying to find C2 activity in your environment. Okay, so what's the alternative? Is there an alternative? There is. It's called Zeek, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk about Zeek.
John, I love the way you set that up. Hopefully everyone watching this right now or watching this recording knew this was coming, because I'm going to be honest with you, hearing you walk through those problems of analyzing multiple disparate network sources rang so true to my heart, because it surfaced so many historical issues I went through. And that's why I'm really happy to be here talking about how can we do this a little bit differently. So let's head to the next slide really quick, John, because what I want to do is express first off, folks, that John has put me in a pretty tough position. He's only given me a little under an hour to talk about Zeek, and I'm sharing the stage with other folks. So I've got to keep this limited because we could be here all day. But Zeek is one of my favorite tools. Tool may even seem like an underhanded word. It is a ridiculously capable open source platform that takes all of the various problems and concepts that John talked about previously and brings them all together into compact, high fidelity logs that give you insight into your network. I like to think from a security perspective, but John, I will say, you talked a little bit earlier about a lot of the logs that people have pulled from before for security purposes are not designated necessarily for security purposes. I'll say that Zeek offers the best of both worlds. I can use it for audit, performance, what's going on inside of my network, but it is so much more geared towards security. It is an excellent NSM tool, network security monitoring tool. And it provides you, as I mentioned, takes all that raw traffic and throws it into a set of logs that we're going to talk about in just a moment. It has the ability for file extraction. It also has a scripting language built into it. And it has, as you can see at the bottom of the right-hand side, a ridiculous community behind it as well. Why do we love this? We love this because as defenders, as someone who's been involved in defense and incident response for far too long now, way too often do we encounter tools that collect good data but lack on one side of it, or they miss an entire protocol, or they require too much manual intervention. And Zeek just happens to solve all of those problems here for us. It is completely open source, which is an awesome side of it as well. I will say the folks here from Corelight do maintain a version of Zeek that they have with their products. John's going to talk to us about that a little bit later, but I'm not lying. If you are looking for a network security monitoring solution and you're watching this webcast right now, you can go download it and start inspecting your network right now. You might need to wait for it to compile if you want to compile it yourself, but otherwise you're good to go. We teach it in SANS courses. It's part of various certifications out there. It partners with major vendors in the security space. And as I mentioned, there's some ridiculous community involvement behind it. You're going to hear us talk about some of these in this presentation, so I won't spoil it too much. The one that we will not talk about today that I do want to make, or I should say we won't emphasize today, but I do want to make sure everyone's aware of, it's the one at the bottom, the community ID for flow pivots across tools. Quick little plug, there is another Corelight webcast, another SANS webcast with Corelight folks that we did a little bit earlier in this year. It talks about combining Suricata and Zeek together for combined analysis across tools. But I want to bring us back to the C2 identification. How do we detect it? How do I implement this in my network and make it happen? Let's head to the next slide really quick, John. Here's the way it works, everyone. Zeek is not a box or a device, if you will, that you're going to necessarily like put in front of your network in the perimeter, and it's going to be both your firewall and all your other capabilities and whatnot. It is, for all intents and purposes, a fantastic monitoring tool that I will pipe traffic and pipe data into in order to pull back the logs of interest, the files of interest, the data of interest. Remember, John talked earlier, we need data in order to build and formulate hypotheses and test our C2 detections. Zeek is going to be the ultimate provider of that data. Couple of things working together here. First off, you may notice that Zeek has multiple outputs. We can push our logs, our insights, the various types of telemetry from Zeek out to a SIM or an analytics platform. You're going to see us actually utilize some examples today. I also mentioned that Zeek has the ability to extract files. You can just have those sit in a place for later retrieval. You can also push them off into a file analysis tool or execute them in a sandbox if they're applicable, things like that. Lots of different feature sets available here. You can also add on to Zeek. In its heart, Zeek is going to give you fantastic insight into various network protocols and various network activity. I can enrich that and add on to it if I want to with multiple third-party sources. But let's bring it back. Let's talk about the logs. So if you're watching through this diagram here, I want that top arrow to be my focus. What makes Zeke Log so special? Or Matt, why on earth are you standing here singing the praises of a log file and not telling me how to find C2 traffic? And I'm going to say because Zeek is going to give you some of the best, most insightful, most impactful logs you're going to get across any network platform out there. We've got a few examples in here. If you cannot read these slides, two things. First off, that's the point. I want you to think about SMTP traffic, HTTP traffic, DNS, extracted files, so on and so forth, and think about how much metadata you're pulling out right now compared to how much metadata I'm showing you is available inside of these. Second, and John, we'll see if we can get the link thrown into the chat at some point for this presentation's over. There are also cheat sheets made available from Corelight, if you will, that actually have kind of blown up or higher resolution versions of these log diagrams here. But I want you to look at the connectivity between these. You may notice that there are some shared data points. There's some arrows linking these things together. And that is one of the other beautiful benefits of using Zeek for network security monitoring and detection and analysis. Because think about it. Let's think about what happens on your network at any point in time. packets fly across, packets move in, packets go out, data is being transferred. Well, I could send an HTTP request. That's going to involve a DNS query to find that website. I may download some files from that particular site. I may perform some additional activity. I may download multiple files. Maybe that loading that one web page spawns multiple DNS requests to resolve ad sites and other subpages and whatnot. Well, these are all connected activities. And what the folks at Zeek have done, and have done very, very well, is they've realized, wait, all of these things are linked together. We should represent it as such in our logs. And those are the connections that you see being established inside of this diagram here. So first and foremost, you're going to have a synchronized timestamp with microsecond accuracy across the logs. Second, this is my favorite one. It's the UID. It is a unique ID that is given to every connection. Notice I said connection. I didn't say website. I didn't say DNS request. I didn't say file that you download, because think about what may happen during a connection event, and Zeke's going to tie all of that together for us. And then, of course, it's also going to assign sub IDs. Look at our very bottom. We've got file unique IDs that are assigned for every file seen on the network. Zeek has the ability to hash these on the background. And as I mentioned earlier, we can also push these off to external sources, file analysis tools, things like that. John, let's head to the next slide, because I'm going to zoom in on one log for our folks watching here just to kind of exemplify what's going on here. Here's a DNS log. We've got Zeek at the top and a typical query at the bottom. Now, before anyone says it to me, well, Matt, you know, I could implement my own custom log format and I could probably get a lot of the same information. Maybe you could. But I'm going to tell you that you're spending time writing custom log formats. Folks, that top box, that zeekdns.log, that's out of the box. That is install, ready to run, rock and roll, go, done. I get microsecond timestamps. There's my unique identifier. I get 5-tuple call records, round trip time, content of response. I get all sorts of DNS information. I get the, excuse me, I obviously get domains that are being resolved. But more importantly, this log entry on its own does nothing for me. But I can take that connection ID, that CNFHP01 that you see at the top in green, and I can go link that back with what else happened during that particular connection, during that particular session. And I'm going to set the stage a little bit, because I'm going to ask Vince to come on next and start talking to us about C2 techniques. But I want to ask you all to think a little bit about the example I just gave you. I gave you one DNS log entry, and I said, what else happened during that particular time? Because if this DNS entry, now I know it's maps.google.com, but if this DNS entry ended up being malicious in some way, shape, or form, how would you then correlate that with all the other activity that went on during that period in time? And that's really where I think the power of a tool like Zeek comes in, especially for C2 connectivity. Because if you find C2 connectivity, everyone, you're not looking at an event in vacuum. You're looking at a lot of things happening together. And now we're going to talk about how to correlate and bring those things together. So Vince, I'm going to hand it over to you, because I think you've got some examples of finding C2 techniques with all the data I just talked about.
Great, thanks, Matt. That is an awesome intro to Zeek, and definitely I feel your excitement because I've also lived through the pain of trying to use those other data sources and then having the light bulb moment of being able to use Zeek's powerful data to do response, and finding that my job got a lot easier, a lot faster, and I was much more likely to be able to resolve the questions that I had in the end rather than being left with some open questions. So let's jump to a couple examples of now finding C2 in the wild with the Zeek data. So again, as part of that taxonomy we saw, we're going to be looking at using the data to actually go in and find something in the default Zeke logs, right? So we're not using a detection. This is just stuff that you would get right out of the box with either open source Zeek or with Corelight. So here's one example, right? A non-standard port. So pretty common, simple example of maybe how C2 might be used in your network, but also a powerful example of how to find this sort of data in the Zeek logs. So attackers might be using, you know, a non-standard port to try to again hide their traffic. Blend in with the noise, maybe particular, you know, ports are more likely to be inspected. In this case, port 80, you know, maybe 443. We talked about 25. You know, various ports that are either more likely to be inspected or more likely to trigger some sort of, you know, either alert or something that a you know SOC analyst might be tipped off to. So as an attacker, I'm thinking, great, I'll just try to avoid this detection. I'll try to blend in with the noise, and I'll use some sort of non-standard port. So let's go over to Splunk and take a look at exactly what some of this might look like in the log. So you can see basically what this query is doing is looking in the Corelight connection log, which again is the high level kind of metadata record for every single connection. So every connection that Zeek sees is going to have this record. It's going to show all the information about the IP addresses and the ports and the times and all that stuff, right? So what we're saying is let's look for all instances where the service has been identified as HTTP. And this is important, right? This is not just saying, hey, if it's on port 80, it's HTTP. This is actually Zeek's dynamic protocol detection using full deep packet inspection to look into the network connection and say, what is this protocol appear to be using? And in this case, it's parsing it out, it's analyzing it, it's detecting it as HTTP, because it's parsing as an HTTP protocol, right? So it's identified as HTTP regardless of what port it's on. The second part of the query is then saying, great, it's HTTP, look for all that stuff. Then look for anywhere where it's not on port 80, it's not on port 8080, and it's not on port 443. So I've taken out the kind of most common ports I might see plain text HTTP on, and then show me all the rest and sort those by count. So what you see in the first column on the left is the response port, and then on the right, the number of instances of that. So we're sorting by count. Our top count is this 16,122, and then you see some other ports. Great, so now we've taken all the data in our network, we've looked for anything using plain text HTTP that's not on the common ports, and we've sorted it by count in, kind of ascending order here. So we've got a great list of strange ports that people are using HTTP on, and now I could dig in and go one more click and say, let's take a single example. All right, so here's an example on port 8000, right? We've got 54 examples of a particular, connections that are using HTTP on port 8000. Wonderful. So now we've decided this, maybe I got a tip that a particular piece of malware is using command and control on 8000. Maybe I just had a hunch that this is something strange, or I was investigating something related to port 8000. Whatever it is, I've got the data at my fingertips, I can now dig in. So one more click and you see we're now pivoting into the connection record for a single connection. So now I've said, here's our destination port 8000 there. On the bottom, you see that unique identifier that Matt talked about. So I can now link this particular connection and all of the other data in the protocol logs related to it to this unique identifier. So instead of taking the timestamp and the 5 tuple and putting all it into Splunk and trying to come up with all of the information around this particular event, I can put in that UID. So in this case, I'm looking, I see a bunch of the information about the connection, including the IP addresses. I've got the MAC addresses in this case. I've got a whole bunch of info. If we do one more click, we'll now show I can now pivot into, using that unique identifier, this particular HTTP log event. So now we're moving from the connection log, which is the high level information about the connection, into the protocol log for HTTP. And there, Zeek has done the analysis using its HTTP analyzer and given me all sorts of stuff particular to HTTP only. So now I see the method, it's actually a post. I see the body of the post, and I see this, encoded text here. I see the file UIDs that you heard Matt mention. These are actually in this case, it's plain text we see towards the bottom, right? It's those actual files that are transferred over HTTP in plain text have their own unique file identifier. So I could actually go and pull those up if I wanted to. But in this case, I think just from looking over this particular HTTP log, I can see a host, it's got a name, I can see a refer that has, what looks to be maybe either, some sort of check-in, maybe it's an ad, I don't know, right? But there's enough in here for me to now take possibly domain or the URI or something else in this data that I'm looking at right here on the screen. Maybe I paste it into virus total. Maybe I take it and compare it to that, malware, report that I was reading in the morning that triggered me to go start this investigation. I've got a lot of data here to now be able to go and pivot. And again, a pretty simple example where this could or could not be C2, but showing you that all the data is right here. All you need to do is take a couple quick searches, and I've now pivoted from every host on my network into strange HTTP on unusual ports into a particular example where I can dig down into our URL, a referrer, and a host, and a HTTP method that could actually indicate malicious activity or C2 activity in this case.
Awesome. Thank you, Vince. Let's go into another example. All right, you're saying HTTP, unencrypted traffic. Okay, well, what if they're encrypting their communications? Then what? Well, first of all, you might be surprised how many attackers are using HTTP in the clear to conduct C2 activity. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a few slides around the detection problem of C2. But let's assume for a second that they're encrypting their communications. Well, then what? What if they're not showing anything in the clear from a payload perspective about what's going on? So there's not an HTTP record generated or a DNS record generated. Well, what do you have? A lot, actually. Zeek is really, really good at parsing encrypted protocols, and that's doing so without breaking and inspecting the traffic, right? There's a bunch of observable information in an encrypted connection that has nothing to do with the payload information itself, with it needing to be able to actually see it, right? It's the nature of the handshake, the certificate used in the connection, the characteristics of those encrypted packets, the size, the timing, the frequency of communication, right? There's all of this great metadata that's inspectable without breaking and inspecting a connection. And Zeek does this with flying colors, and it turns all of those observations into these encrypted protocol logs, SSH, RDP, SSL, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can use these encrypted traffic logs that Zeek generates to go hunting for encrypted channels that are actually being used for C2. So let's take a look. Here's an SSL log. This is a log that Zeek generates by default, right, about encrypted SSL connections. And what we're highlighting here at the bottom is a couple fields in this SSL log that are worth noting because they can be helpful for trying to figure out if you might have a C2 problem in your environment. So let's take a look top to bottom. You're seeing there at the top details about both the issuer, and if you go down 3, the subject of the certificate, right? That's cnexample.com, the department it was issued by, et cetera, the location tied to that certificate. So you've got a great bunch of details there about that information. You also have JA3 and JA3S. What are those? What are those alphanumeric strings that you're looking at? Those are fingerprints. Those are fingerprints of that connection. So basically, it's a hash calculation of that encrypted connection, which is really powerful. It's a capability that was developed by the open source community. Matt alluded to this really powerful and active open source community behind Zeek. JA3 is a phenomenal proof point of that activities that comes out of that community. A group of engineers developed this technique to fingerprint encrypted connections. That's called JA3. Well, why does that matter? Well, you can start whitelisting and blacklisting encrypted connections. So there might be a known JA3 fingerprint associated with a C2 connection of a known group or a known attacker, right? Helpful information that you can now overlay on this JA3 hash and start automatically flagging when those particular blacklisted fingerprints show up in your environment. You're also seeing detail there at the bottom about the nature of the certificate. Was it self-signed? What version of TLS is it using? Maybe you might start a hunt by saying, I believe that a leading indicator of risk for people potentially abusing encrypted channels in my environment for C2 might be that they're using self-signed certificates because attackers can be lazy, or they just simply don't want to deal with kind of licensing and paying for a trusted certificate, right? So they're going to self-sign it. You can do that same filtering that Vince just showed you on the previous slide, right? Take all of your network data and show me just the encrypted connections that are self-signed and start my hunt there. And maybe you'll find a C2 at the end of that tunnel. But Corelight does even more than that. And we're going to talk a little bit about Corelight in these next 2 slides. If you loved what you saw here with Zeek, you're going to love Corelight because all of the capabilities we just described with open source Zeek, you can do with our platform as well. And we take it even further. In our commercial platform, our goal is not only to deliver that same evidence that you saw on previous slides in a scalable, performant manner in whatever SIM you want, but also to extend those insights. And we've done that in our commercial platform. And we've done that particularly around encrypted traffic analysis. So these logs that you see here on screen, the top screenshots, those are the default Zeke logs, right? Those are the default logs you get out of the open source project. It's also what you get with Corelight's commercial platform. But with Corelight's commercial platform, you get even more. On the SSH log, nearly 24 additional insights around SSH traffic, all without break and inspect. Again, none of this requires decryption. What's an example of an insight that Corelight gives you? We can tell you whether it's or not it's keystrokes traversing that SSH connection. Well, why might that matter? If it's a human typing over a suspicious SSH connection, that might be a thread you can pull on as part of your investigation, where previously that's a black box and you don't know if that's a machine talking to a machine or a human typing commands over SSH. SSL, we can tell you and automatically flag, this is a weak cipher. This is an outdated cipher that they're using, and we can put that information directly in the SSL log. RDP, we can tell you that we believe brute forcing is occurring on authentication with that RDP log. Again, an example of an enrichment you're only going to get with Corelight as part of our encrypted traffic collection. So Corelight, I've talked about Corelight now a little bit. Who are we? What's our role in this ecosystem, and how can we help you? We offer an open network detection and response platform. Open because it's based on open source technology, notably Zeek and open source Suricata, a popular IDS technology. And so those are the core kind of technological components of our platform around which we have built proprietary kind of corporate capability sets on top of our platform to both enhance, enrich, and extend the power of those tools. Of course, you're getting the network data from a packet broker or from a cloud tap, so you see those logos there at the bottom. You're sending that data to our open network detection and response platform, and then we are streaming those insights, those detections, and the evidence library that we generate downstream to your favorite SIM, your favorite analytics tool, whatever it is you prefer. We're ready to give you that data and that insight and that detection in the platform, in the pane of glass that you prefer to use. And you can see here in the middle, well, the various components of this platform. There are many. I don't have time today to cover all of them in detail, but I will call out just a few here before moving on. We support Suricata rules. So if you have a favorite Suricata rule set, or you've written your own, or you'd like to write your own, Corelight's a great choice because you can take those existing rule sets, whether those are free open source or paid versions of rule sets, bring them to the Corelight platform and generate a rich set of alerts based around signatures. We also have a class of behavioral threat detections. I mentioned that we're going to talk about C2 detections in the second part of this presentation, and specifically HTTP C2 detections. Corelight has a jam-packed collection of behavioral threat detections around C2. I'm not going to steal Vince's thunder. I'll let him introduce that, but needless to say, there is a huge swath of detection content that ships in Corelight's commercial platform. And lastly, of course, all of the evidence that we've just talked about comes stock and standard as part of Corelight's platform. We have a pre-built set of sensors in any format you need to deliver these insights, these detections in whatever environment, at whatever throughput that you need, up to and including in physically networked environments, a single 1U sensor that can do in excess of 100 gigabits per second of Zeek-based traffic analysis. So among many reasons, customers come to Corelight who are, profound proponents of the open source technology, and yet they come to us for a commercial solution. One of the reasons among many is performance and scale. If you have a large throughput that you need to monitor, it can be tough in the open source world to tune and debug and get that open source deployment up and running. It's totally possible, but it's calories and it's effort. Some people say, you know what, I want to go with a commercial off-the-shelf solution that can scale elegantly. That's Corelight. And our AP5000, which is our newest sensor in this product line you see here, can do that in a 1U form factor. So now let's switch gears and talk about detections, and specifically detections of C2 activity in your environment and what that looks like with Corelight. So Vince, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, John. Great. So as John mentioned, part of the amazing capability that Zeek has is its programming language, right? So at its core, Zeek is an event engine. It's taking all of that complicated and messy network traffic on the wire that you see if you open up Wireshark, for instance, right? And it's taking that and running multiple protocol analyzers on that traffic to export and extract these network events. Those network events are turned into, those logs that we talked about earlier. So that's the fundamental and most basic output of Zeek or Corelight is those logs. But the events are also available for the Zeek programming language. And primarily that is what we have used to write the behavioral detections that John has talked about. So we have a research team of, more than 10 people who are working on tailoring and writing new detection rules based around what we see our customer needs. And so we have a whole bunch of interesting stuff out in the community. As John mentioned, J3 is an example. There's a whole bunch of people who just write Zeek scripts based on, common threats and 0 days that are out in the world, as well as, the basic needs that they need for their own network defense. What we've tried to do at Corelight is kind of take that to the next step by incorporating the best of the community detections in what we call our core collection, and then introducing new collections of this content as well. So you heard John mention our encrypted traffic collection. That's one that has been out for quite a while, and focused on doing this sort of behavioral analysis and using these analysis techniques for encrypted traffic. So you heard about the SSH inferences, certificate hygiene. We have other detections around general detection for kind of unknown encryption techniques, as well as just launching our RDP inferences as part of our last software release that is an update to our encrypted traffic collection. So we have a whole bunch of exciting stuff in the way of the core collection, the encrypted traffic collection. What I'm going to talk to you about today is our next collection that we just debuted, the Corelight C2 collection. So along the same lines, we've had our researchers heads down for close to a year to come up with new and novel techniques to discover and identify and highlight command control, behavior in your environment. And so this is going beyond what you can find just in those logs that we talked about. So those examples I used earlier on, just out of the box Zeek data that you can get either with open source or with Corelight. The stuff I'm talking about now, this is Corelight only. This is only for our customers. And these are a fantastic piece of new, behavioral detections that are part of, what we're providing value above and beyond the open source for Corelight customers. So this is a set of detections and insights, so new log data, new log types, new inferences in existing logs, and particularly new detections or notices as they're known in Zeek lingo. So this collection is composed of these 5 kind of categories. So we'll talk about each one of them, and Matt and I will go back and forth a little bit on how these can help you, and how these are used in the real world for by malicious actors, and how identification of them can really speed your incident response process. And then we'll talk a little bit about what those look like as they come out. So I'll just give a quick highlight here. HTTP C2 detection, domain generation algorithms, a specific interpreter detection, and DNS and ICMP tunneling. So there's a great set of interesting stuff here, and let's go on to dive into each one of these one by one as we walk through. So we'll start with HTTP C2 detection, which I think is one of the highlights of this collection. It's absolutely fantastic. Basically, our researchers looked at many of the existing and most prevalent attack tools and frameworks being used in the wild right now, specifically running over HTTP. And you may say, well, let's see, HTTP, are attackers really still using HTTP? Aren't they encrypting everything so we can't see this? Well, yes and no, right? Oftentimes what you find is modern malware is still traversing over plain HTTP, mostly to blend in with the noise and to potentially avoid inspection on over J3, some of the other things that might be triggering on encrypted traffic. If you blend in with HTTP, there's so much there that you may just find that you're able to squeeze through. Oh, and by the way, you can also just encrypt your payload with your own proprietary encryption within that plain HTTP. So from the attacker's perspective, everything's still hidden in terms of their communications, but they're traversing over an unencrypted connection. Well, that actually helps us out as the defenders, and especially using Zeek, because we have such a great HTTP analyzer in Corelight and Zeek. So what this detection collection does is basically look at a bunch of the different properties using essentially what we've done before with our inferences, right? Stringing together instead of just a single signature match, instead of just a single instance of I'm looking for this string in a particular HTTP connection. It's actually looking for various things around the ordering and the headers of HTTP and how many are there and in which order and the capitalization, all this sort of stuff, right? And putting it together in specific ways that are much more behavioral and durable than just a single identifier for a particular thing. So by doing that, we're able to create this framework of inferences to identify and detect a number of different malware families. I'll let Matt riff for a little bit on why this is really important, and then we'll show an example.
Yeah, so first off, I hope everyone's paying attention to some of the tools that have been called out in the list to the right there. I'm really excited about this list because there's a couple of names or there's a couple of tools on this list that I'm going to assume if you're a defender who's been watching the news in the past 6 months or so, you probably recognize some of these names. I won't pick on any name, but I'm just going to say that these are very, very popular tools kits that are very popular exploit kits that are out there. And the fact that the Corelight team was able to sit down and profile these and figure out what these various toolkits look like, what their signatures look like, and build that into detection. Folks, I hope you're appreciating like kind of the game-changing stance that this is right now. I talked a little bit earlier about the ease with which you could install, deploy, and start monitoring network traffic with Zeek. And now kind of like with Corelight on board, you see how we can level up really quickly and detect some of these toolkits. Vince, you brought up something interesting, and John, you mentioned this earlier too, about, well, won't my attackers just move towards encrypted traffic? And I think it's not I'm not going to call it a false assumption. It is a correct assumption that a lot of defenders assume the attacker will always take advantage of the most complex method, most complex technique out there. Oh, if I can encrypt my traffic using a stolen certificate or using a forged certificate, I can just hide behind a CDN provider and I can do domain fronting and blah, 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 and all of these things. And it will be impossible for the security team to ever find me. I think that's how everyone thinks attackers sit down and like plan out their C2 activities. And I'm not going to say I've ever been in those conversations, but I'll tell you from personal experience, you'd be surprised how often plain text visible protocols get used for attacker communications in 2021, let alone the past few years. We've had lots of technology that attackers could use to work around this. And John talked earlier about how to profile encrypted comms. But if you're sitting there thinking, well, no one really does this anymore, I'm here to say you're very, very wrong in that assumption. A lot of these toolkits have HTTP C2 right out of the box, meaning the person who installs it and runs and deploys their first reverse shell is going to get an HTTP connection. And guess what? It's going to have the same custom signatures that we expect to see in kind of normal other communications. The other thing, and you may notice Corelight's called this out in here, the first bullet on this list is Emotet. Emotet is actually, for all intents and purposes, a malware family. And there's other malware families. Folks, these things are hard-coded with their C2s baked into them. Yes, an attacker could change the code base, but you've got to think, if you hard code a widespread piece of malware with a C2 and then deploy it to a target list victim, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of systems. There was another one on this list. John, I asked you to take it out earlier, but I'm not going to reference it as an example because it is in kind of the line part, if you will. There's other malware families in there too, TrickBot being one of them. And as a defender, I want you all to think about these hard-coded C2s that are baked into there, the protocols that they utilize, and the Corelight team sat and said, wait a second, we can actually profile this, provide that in the form of a detection. And just so everyone's clear, what Vince is sharing with you here, this is not, hey, you might want to go look at this network connection. This is, we recognize Meterpreter. This is, we recognize Emotet. This is like straight to the punch of identifying some malicious traffic over this particular protocol that I'm telling you is still very, very common out there. Vince, I'm going to hand the mic back over to you because I know you've got an example to hopefully exemplify what it is I'm walking through here verbally.
Totally. That's a great intro, and that's exactly the point that I was hoping to drive to, right? Is this, what does this HTTP C2 package come out to? What does it deliver? It just delivers a notice, an alert, right? Here's an example of one saying potential C2 traffic, TrickBot. The post included the text OS password. Boom. Here is the message, and that would include a severity level. It would include the host address of the potentially infected machine, and it includes a link to say, hey, if you want to go see more, go take a look at that HTTP log that we were examining earlier. You might find something else in the URL or in the post content that is actually more illuminating, but I have identified what I believe is TrickBot malware, and that's it. It's a simple detection designed to provide you a very high signal, low noise way to detect malware. And you'll find as we go through the rest of this collection that that's really the theme here, right? We've focused in on particularly identifying known malware tools and command and control tools and families, and identifying those, with very low rates of false positives. Because who wants a whole bunch of another, 100 or 1,000 alerts that you have to go through to try to prove out whether these are right or not, right? We have the log data underlying all this that allows you to go threat hunt and go do those exploratory investigations. But if you just want to know, hey, do I have a host that's infected? This is going to tell you that. And yeah, let's move on to the next one, and I think you'll understand a little more. Here's just as we jump into the HTTP log, you see there's the entire post body. You see that OS passwords link, but you also see more than that, right? You see, oh, it's actually on this particular PC with this particular name and going over this particular path. So a whole bunch of information that we've delivered from the alert down into the data and beyond. So we'll move into another one now. We have two around tunneling detection, DNS and ICMP. There are several ways that these are used, right? We have basically for both DNS and ICMP a specific and a generic kind of identification technique for each of these. The specific, again, is directly back to what we just talked about. It's looking for known tools that use DNS or ICMP tunneling techniques. And, there's a bunch of these that are out in the wild. And so these are likely tools that if you see these, again, you're just going to get an alert that says this particular tool has been found, which is fantastic. Keeps the, again, the signal to noise ratio very high and helps you identify known compromised machines that are using these known tools. But we've also recognized that there's a bunch of tools or techniques that are being used that aren't going to be known. And so we do have some generic behavioral analysis techniques designed to find these sort of tunnels too. In the DNS tunneling example, it's actually really cool because the generic algorithm is based on something that one of our co-founders, Vern Paxson, who's the original creator of Bro Zeek, wrote as a paper with a number of other authors, 10 or 15 years ago. And so it's an awesome paper that we could link you to that shows a particular technique of finding DNS exfiltration using, essentially sizes of the payload and then winnowing those over time and looking for anomalies, et cetera, identifying them. So we've kind of productionized that algorithm and put it into this detector. I'll pause there for Matt to kind of riff on this for a minute, and then we'll move on to ICMP.
Yeah, so Vince, I was waiting to drop this reference, and I'm glad I waited until now. If you are familiar with the SolarWinds Sunburst attack that took place in December of last year, and well, I should say was announced or disclosed in December of last year, I hope that you're paying attention to the past two detections that Vince is talking about, because those attackers utilized DNS and HTTP as, I'm going to call it, their initial and in some cases their primary C2 mechanisms. And it's really, really impactful to think about, okay, here's an example of DNS tunneling. And I know some of you who have been in security for quite a while can remember when DNS tunneling probably was a bigger concern than it may be now. But I'm telling you, attackers are aware of where defenders are no longer looking or have kind of forgotten. And first off, hats off to the Corelight team for remembering this. And Vern, that paper, if you're listening or watching, thanks for the continued research on it, because we get really good detections like this that still pick up on techniques that attackers utilize today. And that's kind of, I think, Vince, what I want to make sure everyone takes out of this is not only the power of these detections, but also the relevancy with regards to today's malware and today's attackers. Now, DNS, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is a protocol that Zeek understands, gives you great log entries for, and we saw a log example of this earlier as well. But folks, DNS, in my opinion, it's a double-edged sword, and here's why. First off, if you had to give me any forensic artifact, I can only pick one from a network, it would be a really close toss-up between DNS and essentially connection logs in Zeek terms, or NetFlow, which is a lesser version, but still it would be kind of movement of traffic around the environment. But DNS would be my top protocol there. And my reason for that is it is so much insight that you can get out of these logs, whether it's just normal user activity all the way to how attackers are abusing it, various techniques and whatnot, because it is such an integral protocol when it comes to kind of networking in general. But here's the other side of that sword. It's also very busy. It's also very noisy. Therefore, a lot of organizations, unfortunately, and this is once again experience as of last week, earlier this week even, a lot of organizations forget it. They leave it off to the wayside. They don't include DNS in their monitoring. They don't include it in their detections. They don't include it in their NSM. It is simply just kind of forgotten. And it's given that old adage of, oh, too busy. We don't have time to sort through all of this. And that's the other area where a detection like this really hits hard, because Zeek realizes, okay, you don't have time to inspect every single DNS record. Got it. We built a detection that does that for you. And as Vince mentioned, it's going to detect those generic and specific tunnels, give you that insight back. And I'm just a huge fan of this one, because this plus HTTP, I'm going to be honest with you all, you're putting a double-digit percentage dent in attacker success rates. So thanks, Vince. But this is another one that I think is going to be huge as more and more folks adopt it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Matt. And you see at the bottom, right, there's the example of, again, another specific DNS tunnel alert that would come up showing, hey, here it is. It's called Your Freedom. It's a specific DNS tunneling tool. Here's the query. Here's the resolver. Here's all the DNS information. We jump to the next slide. You'll see a similar kind of alert for ICMP. In this case, it's focusing on that generic detection that we talked about. So a payload mismatch saying, I saw, there's multiple ways that ICMP tunneling can be used. In our generic detection, we're focused strictly on the echo or ping, and so traditionally you have an echo request and a reply. And so if you see the normally the echo request will contain something in the payload that should be echoed back identically in the reply. In this case, there's a payload mismatch indicating that either one or the other was not the same, right? So that's an anomaly, and that's highlighted and plays a part in that algorithm to identify a generic ICMP tunnel. So again, ICMP also used in a similar way as DNS to for command and control and for data exfiltration. And so we've got specific known tools that are identified, as well as this generic approach for ICMP echo. We'll move on now to another one, which is super powerful and also well known as an attacker technique. That's domain generation algorithms, right? And this is the idea that you can take a long, rather random domain name and use those as part of your command and control infrastructure, so that it makes it harder for defenders who are looking to just match on particular malicious domains to basically overwhelm them with hundreds or thousands of potential domains for a single day or an hour that an attacker might use, right? It becomes very hard to use just block lists to go after this, and so a lot of modern malware will use domain generation algorithms in order to craft these long domain names. Now, that's a common technique. It's been used for a long time. I'd say, Matt could probably weigh in on this, but it's come up and come down in terms of its popularity, but it's still being used. And I think anyone who has attempted to do this in, let's say, Splunk or on the command line, or written a little Python program or whatever to actually do this in kind of a statistical or lexical way for analyzing and identifying DGAs, you'll find that it's almost impossible, right? We have all sorts of programs that use long random domains like endpoint software, EDR, Google Safe Search, all these things that are actually coding information into domain name requests and then sending them back for legitimate purposes, right? So just as the attackers are using them to generate long, complicated domains that we can't identify, that sort of technique is also being used for very legitimate purposes all over the internet. So when you go after this problem, which our researchers kind of took a look at this from the top down, how do we go after and actually do this? We found that using those sort of analysis approach that is traditional, where you just say, hey, let's look for everything really complicated, let's calculate the entropy, let's look at the length, all of those are really prone to high false positive, low signal. And that's not what we were looking for, as we described in this collection. So we took a different approach, right? What we did is a number of the generators for these particular DGAs are published. They're available in some open source lists. There's researchers who are actually reverse engineering or pulling these out of the malware and then publishing them. And so what we did is actually pull together the lists of those generators, which cover more than 44 different malware families and their variants. And we just essentially calculate those because the active domains for each day have to be calculated on a known timestamp. So we essentially create the list based on all of those different families for every day, and then we just match against those. It's literally just essentially a match list, or a series of IOCs that are being matched once this algorithm completes. So instead of looking for something that's an anomaly, we look for actually what's known bad using one of these generators per day. It's a very different approach, but again, what it's focused on is finding known malware. This will not find the unknown DGA that's being used in some zero-day APT threat. That's actually not what it's designed for, but it will find most of the common malware that's using DGAs today on your network and identifying it with this particular, simple notice saying, hey, I've found an infected host. So I'll hand it over to Matt to explain why maybe that'll help you out more than you think.
Yeah, no, Vince, great point. You brought up the interesting side of it is, folks, the technical acumen that went behind kind of identifying and figuring out these domain generation algorithms and then building the code into Zeek. So I don't want to talk too much about malware. I want to instead show you kind of but talk to you about the behind the scenes of what's really going on here and the power of this particular tool. So I mentioned earlier where Zeek kind of sits in that monitoring state, generates those great logs, gives you that really unique data insight. And I also mentioned that it's got its own scripting language, it's extensible, so on and so forth. This right here, in my opinion, is the perfect example of how you take an extensible tool and make it do something incredible. This is not a daily JSON block list that you download and sync with your, security tool and hope that it catches everything that's out there. No. This is actually research that goes in, and the DGAs are expanded on a daily basis based on knowledge, as Vince said, based on the knowledge of the malware, based on the knowledge of the seeds and all the other various details. And it is an active, ongoing thing that happens, meaning this tool is somewhat able to figure out or determine what the malware's today, what its network communications may look like tomorrow. And I'm just a huge fan of the technical capability there, because as a defender, and if you're looking for kind of like the why or the win here, as a defender, this allows you to identify the easily known malware and, folks, clean that up off your network, get that out of there. So then you can focus on the big things, the attacks that are coming through, some of the other detections, the big pieces of malware that may be causing more havoc inside of the environment. But you know what, Vince, I've spent enough time talking about how excited I am about all of this. I just have one question for you. This is great in theory and concept, but does this stuff actually work? Is there, can you give us an example of where this actually came to fruition and proved, yes, this works very, very well?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt. And let me tell you a little story, right? So we have a program called Polaris. It's part of our customer research program, where essentially we cite Corelight sensors with some of our customers. We provide the gear. The customer agrees to provide us access to their network traffic and allow researcher access into those boxes. So what we use those for is to actually test, develop, and iterate the detections that we've just talked to you about. So as part of that, we get to expose, new detections and new ideas to real live network traffic, which is vitally important in order to, scale these things up and find false positives and, tune these things, as opposed to just a researcher sitting in, their home office on their laptop, calculating or using PCAPs against this, right? It's not the same. So what we do is, put these detectors into our Polaris environment and see what happens. Well, in this particular example, we had multiple examples where our detections found a known red team at one of our Polaris sites, right? And this was awesome. So day one, this HTTP C2 package that we talked to you about today found Cobalt Strike Interpreter. Lit up like a light. We sent off a note to the site. They said, yep, actually, we've got the red team here. Great job catching them. And, let us know what else you see. So sure enough, continued seeing. Next day, we found a different change in tactic. Instead of using those, they were, using a reverse SSH tunnel. And we actually found out using those SSH inferences that we talked to you about before. Oh, a known person was actually typing. We identified keystrokes. We identified this is the red team again. A couple weeks later, again, using a different technique, here they are back again, and using Cobalt Strike and Interpreter, we identified them again. So this was an example of where not only were these active attackers and red teamers that didn't know that these detections were being used against them, they were finding them over and over again, and we were communicating with the site. Now, these were in kind of development mode, right? So we were only, they were only seeing these because our researchers were seeing this activity and notifying them. But Now this stuff's published. Now this stuff has gone, the research that went into these detections is published. This is what we've just talked about and what we have released as part of our C2 collection. So if you were a Corelight customer running these in production, you wouldn't get a call from our researchers. You would get an alert saying, hey, I have identified Cobalt Striker interpreter on your network. And so this is just an example of how this isn't, this stuff isn't created in the lab in isolation. This is tested and battle hardened on the networks of the largest enterprises around the world. So I hope that was a great introduction to our new command and control collection, as well as giving you some great examples of how to find command and control in the default Corelight logs or the Zeke logs. And I'll let John wrap up with the summary.
Sure. Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Matt. So in short, right, we've got dozens of C2 techniques documented in Mitre Attack. Check it out if you haven't already to get an understanding of what you're up against. You can, of course, hunt for these in the wild proactively in your environment if you've got access to Zeke logs. You can do that via open source Zeek. You get started today in your home lab. If you've got a commercial implementation, you could also come talk to Corelight. We can get you the same information as well. And you can detect those C2s. We presented today a kind of specific detection capability that comes with our commercial platform. It's got a bunch of different kind of capability sets and malware families and techniques that it can discover. And if you're interested in that, come talk to us. We've got a few questions here and we're just at the top of the hour, so maybe I'll answer one or two really quick and then I'll turn it back over to Carol. Someone asked, because we use open source technologies, do you also submit code and contribute back? Yes, absolutely. We've got a couple of full-time developers on staff at Corelight that just focus on contributions to the open source project and pushing that forward. We also have a community manager who focuses on growing the open source community, and we sponsor, meetups, the open source user conference, competitions, etc. So we're very, very invested as a corporate entity in ensuring that the open source technology remains awesome, free, and open source. And then lastly, there's one more question here, and then I'll turn it over to you, Carol. What is the value add of having Zeek for a mature SIM solution customer like Splunk? Good question. There is a ton of value add. In fact, most of our customers have a Splunk license in addition to other SIMs or data lake technologies they might be using. Splunk and Zeek are peanut butter and jelly, excuse me. If you think about it, Zeek at its core is a really, really rich evidence library. And what you really need to go with it is a great search query tool on top of that evidence library. And of course, Splunk, with all of its multifaceted Boolean kind of query capabilities and rule set building capabilities, is an excellent complement to that data set. So all those screenshots you saw today from Corelight's demonstrations of our detection capabilities or the discovery techniques for C2, those were Splunk screenshots. We chose it for a reason because it's a obviously very popular SIM tool, but it's also a very popular SIM tool for people that are using Zeek. It's a great spot to be consuming and using your Zeek data. With that, we're at the top of the hour. Matt, Vince, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing knowledge. Carol, I'll turn it back over to you for some closing thoughts.
All right, and I'll be sure to send over any questions not answered your way so that you can respond directly. Thank you so much, John, Matt, and Vincent, for your great presentation, and to Corelight for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.